Greetings, Dr. Dellinger and classmates. My name is Corinthia McCain. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today I will be presenting on queer theology. I chose this branch of theology because as a Black lesbian woman, I was moved to discover a theological perspective that speaks directly to two key aspects of my identity. Queer theology, which has roots in liberation theology, resonates deeply with my experiences, both as Black and lesbian. Now, what is queer theology? Let's start with the meaning of queer. For earlier generations, queer was considered a derogatory term, but queer activists have taken the word back. It's simply a synonym for the acronym 2SLGBTQIA+. That is a mouthful. So I'll be referring to 2SLGBTQIA+ as queer for the remainder of the presentation. As for the definition of queer theology, Patrick Chang defines queer theology in 3 different ways. 1, the basic definition is queer people talking about God. 2, talking about God in a self-consciously transgressive manner, meaning intentionally challenging societal norms about sexuality and gender. And then 3, talking about God that challenges and deconstructs the natural binary categories of sexual and gender identity. Queer theology can be traced to these 4 building blocks. Each contributed to the evolution of theology. You have apologetic theology, gay is good; liberation theology, the gospel's acceptance and liberation from the oppression of heterosexism and homophobia; relational theology, God is found in the erotic, in the midst of mutual relationship with another. Queer theology challenges the binary categories with respect to sexuality or gender identity are fixed and impermeable. As for a historical time frame of queer theology, there isn't a clear-cut time frame when it began, but it spans back to the 1950s. It started in the late 20th century with the queer rights movement and liberation theology. This included the feminist movement. The Stonewall riots in 1969 were pivotal events in the modern queer rights movement. Much of this theology unfolded in the context of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, which strongly influenced many gay liberations. The emergence of queer theologies as distinct from gay and lesbian theologies was a gradual process. Shore Goss's 1993 book, Jesus Acted Up, is one of the earliest direct theological engagements with queer theory. The central distinguishing characteristic of queer theology arrived in the 1900s with Marcella Althaus Reid's Indecent Theology. Here we have apologetic theology. Gay is good, meaning queer people can be faithful Christians without hiding or changing their sexuality. Also, the Christian church should accept gays and lesbians as full members. And we have the first major work to rethink the traditionally negative relationship between Christianity and homosexuality was Derek Sherwin Bailey's Homosexuality and the Western Christian Tradition in 1955, based in the UK. Here we have liberation theology, modeled after the various liberation theologies in the 1960s. Based upon the Exodus story of the Israelites' freedom from slavery in Egypt, acceptance of the queer community in the church, freedom from heterosexism and homophobia, as well as to be one's own authentic self, that God preferred the poor and oppressed. And we have the pioneers of liberation theology, which was Gustavo Gutierrez and James Cone. Relational theology, developed primarily by lesbian theologians in the late 1960s and early 70s. It focused on finding God in the midst of the erotic, meaning mutual relationship with one another, and then gender neutral in a welcoming and open manner. Lastly, we have queer theology, based upon queer theorists Michael Foucault and Judith Butler, as well as Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, challenges the essentialist notions of sexuality and gender identity, argues that these concepts are not fixed but socially constructed through language and discourse. It doesn't deny that people are born with same sex attractions and gender variant identities, and that sexual attractions and gender expressions are fluid. Here we have the branches of queer theology. This is not an exhaustive list, of course. There are many, many branches under queer theology um, because it can be broken down in so many different ways. But here are a few that I will go into. Queer liberation theology focus is interpreted through the lens of queer experiences. It seeks to affirm the dignity and worth of queer individuals within the context of Christian theology and fight against the oppression and marginalization of queer people. Then you have gay and lesbian theology, which centers on the experiences of gay and lesbian individuals within religious traditions, advocating for including and affirming these identities in theological discussions. Then bisexual theology examines bisexual identity and experiences in theological context, critiquing binary understandings of sexuality and challenging the erasure of bisexual people in religious discourse. Then we have queer feminist theology. It combines queer and feminist insights to challenge patriarchal and heteronormative religious traditions, advocating for inclusivity and justice for marginalized identities, especially queer individuals and women. It reimagines concepts of divinity, community, and ethics to foster inclusivity. Then we have transgender theology. It explores theological issues and interpretations relevant to transgender experiences, gender identity, and embodiment, often challenging binary concepts of gender in religious thought. And lastly, I have intersectional queer theology. It integrates queer theology with other forms of intersectional analysis, including race, class, disability, and postcolonial theory. It seeks to understand the complexities of how multiple identities interact within religious contexts. Here are a few themes that are emphasized in queer theology, but there, of course, are many more. Here we have incarnation and desire, which celebrates God becoming flesh in Jesus, and diverse forms of desire and body as sacred, challenging historical views on sexuality. From Thinking Theology and Queer Theory, it stated that the divine immersed itself in the flesh and that the flesh is now divine is queer theology at its peak. In Radical Hospitality, it emphasizes communities of inclusion and belonging, especially for marginalized individuals. Queer theology advocates for inclusive, affirming communities where queer individuals find belonging, healing, and resistance. It views Christian fellowship as radical hospitality that challenges exclusion and celebrates diverse expressions of love, family, relationships, reflecting God's expansive love. Liberation and Justice centers justice as an expression of divine love, aligning with the gospel's message of liberation. Queer theology, inspired by liberation theology, emphasizes freedom from oppressive systems like heteronormative patriarchy and cisnormativity. It views God as a liberator against marginalization and frames queer theology as a tool for justice, defining sin and systemic and personal oppression, not identity or sexual orientation. Jones Armstrong states that the dominant white theologies have been used to justify settler colonization, the transatlantic slave trade, and genocide. When these histories are acknowledged, Christians often respond by highlighting instances where Christianity opposed oppression. I believe this also will happen for the queer community where they realize they can no longer justify their oppression. Here we have some influential thinkers in queer theology. This clearly is not an exhaustive list. It's very expansive, but I have Marcella Altheus Reed. She's known for Indecent Theology, which critiques heteronormativity and challenges traditional doctrines around sexuality. Then we have Patrick S. Chang. He's been my major source for this presentation. He's known for an introduction to queer theology, Radical Love. Then we have Virginia Ramey Mollencott, and then also Elizabeth Stewart. Okay, contemporary context for queer theology. Cultural relevance addresses current debates on queer inclusion, gender fluidity, and sexual ethics in churches. Then social justice and activism advocates for an intersectional approach to tackling issues like racial justice, economic inequality, and environmental stewardship, aligning with modern movements. Radical inclusion emphasizes communities prioritizing radical hospitality, offering an affirming faith space for those often marginalized. And the role in today's faith communities encourages traditional churches to adapt to evolving understandings of identity and relationships, fostering an inclusive vision of Christianity. Okay, in conclusion, queer theology continues to evolve, mainly as intersectional approaches address the diverse experiences of queer people across race, class, and gender identity. It challenges interpretations of religious texts and theological frameworks, striving to create an inclusive theology that affirms all people's dignity and sacred worth. Ultimately, Christian views will have to evolve, just as other opinions from the past have evolved to remain relevant. Here we have the discussion questions. They will also be listed in Canvas. And here we have my list of citations. Thanks for your time and attention. You have a great day.